Beyond the heroic mythologized warrior, the nude in ancient Greece also fires another neuron. I'm talking about the Greek athlete. Unlike the imaginary mythical nude hero, Greek athletes did in fact compete in the nude. Easy there, tiger. The representation of this youth in the nude might draw us in two different directions. While all geared up, the youth is clearly preparing to head off for battle. But this solemn goodbye reminds us of the other activity of Greek youths, athletics, which perhaps the old man wishes the youth would sooner be doing before heading off to battle. And don't forget the vessel on which the scene is depicted, a lekythos, a jar for an athlete's oil bath. So what's going on here? Why is the artist conjuring up a scene that might tug us in two directions? Well, just as with the Corinthian pyxis that we looked at before, this lekythos is also a funerary vessel, a grave good. So to take our train of imaginative thought one step further, perhaps we have a scene here reflecting an actual occurrence or some imagined, mythologized, heroicized occurrence of a youth slain in battle, the loss of innocence. No more will he enjoy sport at the gymnasium with his fellow companions. So he's buried with a lekythos to recapture the activities of youth, and he's portrayed here as a heroic warrior worthy of all honor. Just as with the pyxis, here too we have a memento mori. We see a big change taking place in the Archaic period, as Athens emerges as the new cultural superpower, soon eclipsing Corinth. Perhaps the most significant stamp that Athenians place on the Greek world is their interest in the human condition, in morality, justice, pride, and suffering. And this shows up in their vase painting, not so much in the stories that they tell, but more so in the way that they tell their stories. The artist could have chosen to memorialize the deceased as a fallen warrior among other glorious dead, or in the moment of a heroic death on the battlefield. Or he could have represented some other mythical hero like Hercules, Achilles, or Perseus, casting the deceased in a brighter light. Instead, we see a different sort of narrative aesthetic evolving in Attic vase painting. Well, by this late classical period, it's pretty much well evolved. Instead of showing the height of physical action, instead we're presented with a subdued, anticlimactic moment of pause, the quiet before the storm. It's up to the mind of the viewer, up to us to complete the narrative in our minds. Granted, this narrative technique relies on a sort of familiarity with the story. In this case, we may not be necessarily familiar with the story, but different clues like the nude form of the youth, his armament, and his classical contrapposto, that's the stance that he's taken like a statue of some hero. These clues lead us to the conclusion that he's a warrior, and the old man seems to be engaging with him. The rest is our own speculation, but it's an educated and informed speculation. We encounter a lot of similar examples in Archaic and Classical Attic vase painting, where a moment just before the height of climax is represented, rather than showing all the gory details, and the artist relies on the viewer's familiarity with the narrative to connect the dots and lead up to the climax in his or her own mind. Here's a fairly early and exemplary illustration. The Suicide of Ajax, an Attic black figure amphora from around 540 BC, by the very well-known artist Exekias, now in the Château-Musée de Boulogne-sur-Mer. Pardon my French. Ajax fought alongside Achilles in the Trojan War. In later myths and tragedies, he's often elevated practically to the same status as Achilles. Alas, he's probably most familiar to our contemporary audience as the big goober with the warhammer in the 2004 Hollywood production Troy, where Achilles is played by Brad Pitt. The Iliad just tells a fraction of the story of the siege of Troy. A lot happens between the Iliad and the Odyssey, where the latter recounts Odysseus' journey back home from the 10-year-long siege. Apparently there were also other epics that told the stories of other warriors involved in the Trojan War beyond Achilles and Odysseus, sadly now lost. Well, till somebody discovers a Greco-Roman mummy stuffed with papyrus fragments from some lost epic. It's not impossible. But somewhere between the events of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the unthinkable happens. Achilles is killed by Orlando Bloom. Paris. The armament of Achilles is to be rewarded to the most feared Greek soldier. It comes down to Odysseus and Ajax. They get into a big debate, and the arms are finally awarded to Odysseus. There are different accounts of what happens next, but one popular version says Ajax is completely distraught and goes into a mad rage, killing his Greek comrades left and right, or so he thought. Athena intervened and disguised the flocks as his fellow Greeks, so Ajax ended up only slaying the flocks. Completely embarrassed and distraught for a second time for the harm he could have done, Ajax takes the sword of Hector, awarded to him after a stalemate battle against Hector, wanders off from camp and kills himself by burying the sword tip up in the sand and impaling himself on it. So here we see Ajax planting the sword, neatly packing down the earth around it. His shield leans lazily at the edge of the frame, his helmet and spears carefully placed atop. Incidentally, the spear was his weapon of choice, not the warhammer. And now we know what's coming next. Bleh. See, Exekias is relying on our familiarity with the story to bring us to the height of climax and all the gory bits, without having to show the gory bits. It's more engaging, less off-putting, and invites us to consider Ajax's state of mind, to ponder his pathos, the powerful Greek term for suffering and the human condition. And as if that's not enough, Exekias also sneaks in a foreboding omen. Decorating the shield of Ajax is the fiendish Gorgon Medusa, with snakes for hair, said to have been so hideously ugly that her gaze would turn you to stone. And above that is a glaring feline, similar devices to the ones we saw in the Corinthian Pyxis. While it's all perfectly legitimate to have these devices decorating your shield, wouldn't be a pretty sight to have that racing towards you on the battlefield. They also function in the context of the painting as ill omens of the impending tragic conclusion. My goodness, how about that? Thanks for listening. Don't forget to hop on over to the website, scarabsolutions.com, for better quality images, links to external resources, and the extensive bibliography on ancient art. I'm also adding transcripts for each episode, in case you'd prefer to read rather than listen to the podcast. That'll also make it a lot easier if you want to revisit something you heard on the podcast but can't remember exactly where it was mentioned. Simply enter some keywords in the search box at scarabsolutions.com. And in case you haven't noticed, you can leave your feedback for each individual episode at the website, if you have something nice to say, or a particular axe to grind. You can also email me at scarabsolutions@mac.com. And while you're at it, if you like the podcast, I invite you to go on over to iTunes and post a review. It's getting a little lonely out here. Take care, and see you next time on the Scarab Solutions Ancient Art Podcast.